This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. US-China trade tensions ratcheting up. Donald Trump threatens Beijing with a used cooking oil embargo after China stopped buying American soybeans, calling it an economically hostile act. Now, amid rising trade tensions, Spain's foreign minister is in China on a two-day visit to deepen ties. Madrid wants the EU to pivot to Beijing, but is it in the interest of the bloc? South Korea is barring travel to parts of Cambodia and dispatching a special team to rescue citizens trapped in fake job scams. It follows outrage over kidnappings and torture linked to online crime rings. Now, Japan's parliament meets next Tuesday to choose a new prime minister, with ruling LDP chief Sanae Takaichi and opposition leader Yurichiro Tamaki emerging as top contenders. Also ahead on East Asia tonight, Chinese and Malaysian militaries conduct joint exercises right after the Japan-Philippines drill began. We ask an expert what message China is sending. Plus, worries among Hong Kong migrants to the UK as the government debates tightening immigration rules. Of the trade spat between the U.S. and China showing no signs of easing. President Donald Trump now threatening to stop imports of cooking oil from China in retaliation to what he calls China purposefully not buying American soybeans. He said Beijing's action is economically hostile act that is making life difficult for U.S. farmers. Mr. Trump says he's also considering ending other elements of trade as retribution. Well, soybeans are the single largest U.S. export to China in terms of value, with sales amounting to nearly $13 billion last year. But U.S. government data shows China's imports of American soybeans fell nearly 40% by volume in the first half of this year, as Beijing turned to Brazil and Argentina for supply. Mr. Trump's threat to retaliate comes amid rising trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. Yesterday, both countries imposed additional port fees on ocean shipping firms. Beijing says the new levies are aimed at protecting its shipping industry from what it calls discriminatory measures. Well, they were launched in response to U.S. charges on Chinese vessels, which Washington says are intended to support American shipping companies. The latest escalation follows China's announcement last week of expanded export controls on rare earth minerals, a sector China dominates. Now, Mr. Trump responded by threatening additional tariffs on Chinese goods by up to 100%. Well, despite rising tensions, Mr. Trump has affirmed he continues to have a great relationship with Chinese President Xi Jinping. U.S. officials say the two leaders are expected to meet at the APEC summit in South Korea later this month, a meeting Beijing has yet to confirm. Our tensions boiling over to the aviation sector. China's largest state-owned airlines are pushing back against Washington's plan to bar them from flying over Russia when traveling to and from the U.S. Well, they warn that the move could raise fares, increase flight times, and disrupt some routes. Thousands of passengers are expected to be affected, especially during the year-end holiday season. Air China, China Eastern, and China Southern are among the 6 airlines filing objections. The U.S. previously said Chinese airlines enjoy an unfair advantage since American carriers have been barred from Russian airspace after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Most European airlines have been barred following sanctions on Russia. U.S. authorities say they will review public feedback before finalizing the plan. A Spanish Foreign Minister, José Manuel Albares Bueno, is on a 2-day official visit to China as part of efforts to boost ties. Mr. Albares, who is also Spain's EU minister, was invited by his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. Now, he started his tour in Hangzhou City, where he is expected to meet with the Spanish business diaspora, as well as inaugurate the new international campus of the Polytechnic University of Valencia. The visit follows Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping in April. Spain has been pushing for the EU to pivot to China to counter U.S. tariffs. But tensions remain over how approach to Beijing amid allegations of Chinese dumping practices. For more insights, we are joined by Philippe Lacour, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy at Asia Society, and he is speaking to us all the way from Paris. Well, thanks, Professor, for joining us this evening. First up, let's just talk about this visit coming amid escalating U.S.-China tensions. Firstly, why does it matter? What does Spain want from China right now, and what does China want in return?
Well, it matters relatively. I mean, this is only one country, one member of the 27 EU members. What matters most is perhaps when the president of the European Commission travels to China for an EU-China summit that took place last July, as you recall. As far as Spain is concerned, I think the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, met Chinese leader Xi Jinping several times without any reciprocal visits. And now there's a visit by the foreign minister to China. I'm not quite sure really why Spain is so keen on enhancing ties with China, while in fact the level of businesses are quite limited between these two countries. I mean, Spain is about Europe's fifth economy or fourth economy, and it has not really been a strong partner of China. Maybe that's why they want to increase these ties.
Right, and Spain's role on China within the EU is just as important. I mean, some reports put it as Madrid, possibly positioning itself as Europe's middleman with Beijing. But that is something in our earlier conversation, you said it's not something that you agree with.
Well, there's no middleman. I mean, there's a president of the European Council who is Antonio Costa, and there's a president of the European Commission, that's Ursula von der Leyen. They came to Beijing in July and had this a meeting with the Chinese leadership, including President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Li Qiang. So the discussions about trade are to be handled by the European Commission, not by a single state. The single state can do whatever they want in terms of attracting investments from China or from whoever, but in terms of trade, it's the European Commission that is in charge.
So just give us a taste of this, because this balancing act is tested by the broader U.S.-China trade standoff. Washington, they're setting this tariff tempo, while Beijing is weaponizing rare earths. So Europe's kind of stuck in the middle. So, Professor, help us understand this, that even as China is wooing the EU, what sort of leverage does Brussels have to try and break the stalemate?
Well, you're right. It is a difficult time for Europeans, which is why, to make my point again, I don't think it's a good idea for a single country to try to act as a middleman. The right approach is to have a joint approach from the EU. The reason being that the US-China rivalry, which has become so crucial and dangerous in some ways for the rest of the world, including Europe and Southeast Asia, has now led China to impose export controls on rare earth minerals, as you pointed out in your report, which means the Europeans will be also affected by this. And as you know, 98% of most minerals are actually in Europe are imported from China, which is why we need to have a grand bargain, a discussion at the EU level with the People's Republic of China, as opposed to having one member talking to Beijing. So I think, European businesses are very worried about the way businesses are handled. Same thing with electric vehicles and batteries. These are important businesses, but we should not have sort of individual approaches when there is so many serious issues landing on our table when it comes to US-China relations and EU-China relations.
Yeah, so you've mentioned about this joint approach among the EU. We have seen there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity between Europe and Beijing. But somehow, the EU, it still feels that they have this unclear line on China and where it actually stands. So this flurry of activity, does it perhaps signal a policy shift from Brussels?
No. I think the line is still clear that China is seen as a partner, as a competitor, and a systemic rival. That is the official triptych that Brussels has been using. The last EU-China summit that took place in July, as I mentioned, was not very successful in the sense that we could not really agree on market access in China for European companies, which are suffering a lot of sort of red tape, so to speak. While in Europe itself, China wants to sell more steel and more electric vehicles, while Europeans do have a car industry and they want to save jobs, and they are worried about the impact on Europe's economy of this dumping of Chinese vehicles at very cheap prices, and without technology transfer, I must say, which would make a big difference. But I don't believe China is prepared to do that.
Some great insights there. I really appreciate your time and thoughts, Philippe Lacour, Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy at Asia Society, speaking to us live from Paris. Thanks for that. Turning our attention to South Korea now. Well, the country is banning travel to parts of Cambodia, saying it believes that 1,000 of its nationals have been lured into fake jobs and scam centers. Police say 4 of the 63 South Koreans detained by authorities returned home this week. The others will fly home within a month, pending investigations and possible legal action. Now, Seoul is scrambling into action following the killing of a Korean student in Cambodia who was apparently tortured to death in a case linked to an employment scam. It's sending a joint response team to Cambodia this evening, led by Vice Foreign Minister Kim Jin-ah. Some 200,000 people from various nationalities are believed to be involved in scam operations in Cambodia. Some 330 South Koreans have been reported missing or detained against their will in Cambodia between January and August, while 80 are still unaccounted for. One escapee said that he paid $2,000 for a visa to flee.
돈이 있으면 나가고 싶다. 돈이 없는 사람들은 못 나가고.
Japan's parliament will convene an extraordinary session next Tuesday, with lawmakers expected to elect a new prime minister. Political parties now scrambling to form alliances to secure the top job. Well, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's new leader, Sanae Takaichi, is meeting opposition leaders today to win the support that she desperately needs. That's after Komeito abruptly ended its 26-year alliance over a political funding scandal. Now, Japan's largest opposition bloc has floated Yurichiro Tamaki, a leader of the Democratic Party for the People, as a potential unity candidate for prime minister. They're hoping to get the numbers they need to end 13 years of coalition rule under the LDP. Now, Mr. Tamaki's slogan is increase take-home pay, a message that hits home amid a cost of living crisis. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, deflation still gripping China for September, adding to the country's longest streak of economy-wide price declines since the late 1970s. And global insurance losses from natural disasters eclipsed $100 billion in 2025. Hello again. It's time for business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, we're hearing that China taking India to task over at the WTO over subsidies. So tell us what's at stake here.
Well, likely billions of dollars in green tech investment and market access. EV drivers won't feel it, but Indian supply chains and policy could shift. China has filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization over India's electric vehicle and battery subsidies. The incentives cater primarily to firms that have set up manufacturing facilities in India to boost local production and local supply chains. China's Commerce Ministry says India's subsidies gives its domestic industries an unfair advantage that undermines China's interests. The ministry also urged New Delhi to, quote, rectify its wrongdoings, warning that Beijing will take firm measures to safeguard the rights and interests of its own firms. Remember, last year, the Indian government approved a $1.3 billion scheme to boost the adoption of electric vehicles in the country. Meantime, China continues to walk along the tightrope of slipping back into deflation while fighting a trade war with the US. It may have eased last month, but the country is still on track for the longest streak of price decline since the late 70s. Consumer prices were mainly supported by a pickup in transport costs ahead of a long holiday early this month. But apart from this one-off factor, deflationary pressure did not let up much. This despite government attempts to slow or stop the crushing price wars and competition among manufacturers. China's factory gate prices fell at a slower pace for a second straight month in September. In line with Bloomberg estimates, they were cushioned by higher prices and a more favorable base of comparison. The producer price downturn has persisted for almost 3 years now, hurting manufacturers' profits as they have to deal with lukewarm consumer confidence and disruptions from US tariffs as well. Mainland Chinese and Hong Kong stocks making a rebound as investors kept their hopes for a Fed rate cut, overpowering concerns surrounding renewed trade tensions between Beijing and Washington. The Shanghai Composite ending the day 1.2 in the green. Shenzhen, the second bourse, did better, 1.7. And the Hang Seng Index snapping one of its longest losing streak since January, thanks to heavyweight tech counters like Alibaba. And we're also tracking these interesting developments out of East Asia. Apple says it'll increase its investment in China and deepen cooperation there. CEO Tim Cook reaffirmed Apple's long-term commitment to the Chinese market during a meeting in Beijing with Industry Minister Li Leteng. Cook's visit comes as Apple expands spending in the US to $600 billion over the next 4 years, partly to offset US tariffs. Earlier this year, Apple also announced a clean energy fund in China worth some $101 million. Mr. Cook is on a week-long trip that includes visits to Chinese app developers and designers in Shanghai. Apple sales gaining momentum in China's sluggish smartphone market. The iPhone maker saw shipments grow 0.6% from a year earlier to around 11 million units in the third quarter. China's total smartphone shipments for the period dropped 0.6% on year to more than 68 million units. That's correct. Analysts say that the new iPhone 17 appealed to China's price-sensitive consumers. Apple was the only brand among the top 3 vendors to achieve a growth in shipments. Meantime, research firm IDC expects market rebound early in the fourth quarter after recent flagship launches. The Japanese e-commerce and finance giant Rakuten rallied, ending nearly 5% higher after earlier rising as much as 7% on reports it may list its credit card unit in the US. The move reportedly follows SoftBank's plan to list its Pay unit. Rakuten Card, with more than 30 million cards issued in Japan, earned just under $410 million last year, though rising costs have eroded profits. Rakuten earlier shook up Japan's finance sector by simplifying credit card applications and broadening access for consumers. The International Monetary Fund warns renewed US-China trade tensions could significantly slow output, adding that continued protectionism and increased risk could point to tougher times ahead. The IMF earlier upgraded its growth forecast for the year, saying that the global economy is doing better than feared. Nick Harper breaks down the report for CNA from Washington, D.C.
The word uncertainty appears in the IMF's World Economic Outlook report 102 times, and the root cause of that unpredictability? Tariffs. Presenting the report, IMF officials said the effects of those tariffs are already being felt, and there could be worse to come, especially with the possibility of additional flare-ups in US-China trade tensions and increased tariffs.
The tariff shock is here, and it is further dimming already weak growth prospects. This is clear even in the US. Growth is revised down from last year, the labor market is weakening, and inflation has been revised up and is persistently above target, signs that the economy has been hit by a negative supply shock.
Between its last estimate back in July and now, the IMF has increased growth projections for this year for emerging and developing Asia by 0.1%, bumping it up to 5.2%. But that's still down on 2024's growth, and growth is expected to fall even further next year for the region. China's forecast for 2025 remains steady at 4.8% annual growth, while expected growth in Japan has been increased by 0.4%, and India and the US both get a more modest increase of 0.2%. But if tariffs continue, the IMF warns of prolonged uncertainty, more protectionism and labour supply shocks, with many countries and regions forecast to have even lower growth in 2026. Also out on Tuesday was the IMF's Global Financial Stability Report. It noted that global markets have been largely resilient in recent months. But Tobias Adrian, the director of the IMF's Monetary and Capital Markets Department, says market optimism masks potential threats.
Changing investor expectations about AI and its impact on the economy could trigger asset valuations to reprice. Currently, investors see AI as a driver of profit margins, but that could shift at some point. Second, government debt is growing. This is putting pressure on bond markets. Third, banks and non-banks are increasingly interconnected, which could spread stress.
The global economy has proved resilient in the face of the Trump administration's tariffs. But that may not last, with the IMF warning a tariff war escalation still poses a significant risk to global growth. For CNA, I'm Nick Harper in Washington, D.C.
Global insurance losses from natural disasters have already topped $100 billion this year. It's the sixth year in a row such losses have crossed that threshold. A report by Gallagher Re estimates that insured losses for the first 9 months is at about $105 billion, driven by major wildfires in Los Angeles and severe storms across the U.S. early in the year. But the third quarter brought some relief. Now, losses came in at below $15 billion, the lowest quarterly figure since 2016, thanks to subdued hurricane activity. Scientists say rising global temperatures are fueling more frequent and intense natural disasters, from hurricanes to wildfires, keeping insurance losses high. They also expect 2025 to rank among the 3 hottest years on record. Now, Gallagher's chief science officer, Steve Bowen, says if the final quarter stays relatively calm, it could help replenish the reinsurance industry's financial buffers heading into next year. And that'll do it for business. Otelli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. On that note, let's go for a short break now. But coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese and Malaysian militaries embark on joint drills at a time when the South China Sea remains a source of contention. A discussion with Dr. Oi Sun from the Singapore Institute of International Affairs in just a moment. Hello, this is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. South Korea bans travel to parts of Cambodia following nationwide anxiety over a widening job scam crisis targeting its nationals. And Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares Bueno on an official visit to China as part of efforts to boost ties. His trip coming as Madrid is pushing the EU to pivot to China to counter US tariff. And U.S.-China trade tensions going up. Donald Trump threatens Beijing with a used cooking oil embargo after China stopped buying American soybeans. The U.S. leader calling it an economically hostile act. And earlier we had a chat with Jeff Moon, president of China Moon Strategies and former assistant U.S. trade representative for China. And he warned that both sides have strong economic weapons they can use against each other.
The best latest news is that the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer today said that he thought that they would push through and get some kind of a summit. Apparently, a time has been reserved, I see in the press, for a meeting in South Korea. So I think we need to try to be optimistic, even though there's a lot of downside pressure on the bilateral relationship.
Oh, Jeff, you've done this before as a trade guy to China, so I want you to dust off your hat. And I want to ask you whether this sort of tariff threat cycle of repeated easing to escalation and rinse and repeat again, has that ever worked with China before? I mean, it clearly has worked with a lot of other countries in the current context.
Well, in fact, there's nothing new here. All of the issues that you mentioned are old issues that have been there for a long time. Soybeans, for example, for the U.S. sort of confirms for Americans that China did not live up to its Phase 1 deal in 2020 to buy a lot of agricultural goods. The shipbuilding issue is about China's longstanding policy of subsidizing Chinese firms and destroying foreign competition and capturing overseas markets. Rare earths dates back to 2010 with the first boycott of the Japanese. And what's just happened is that this is a reflection of China's effort to codify its informal coercion economically against other countries. The problem here, the most alarming thing, I think, is the rare earth situation. I think China's overreached by sharing its detailed plan that could paralyze the entire global electronic supply chain. And I think all nations should be concerned by that, and confidence in China will suffer as a result.
Speaking of China's strategic calculus here, Jeff, and you've said before in the past that China tends to retaliate 100% plus 10% and eat the pain for nationalism. How deliberate are these latest moves that you mentioned by Beijing within its strategic playbook? And do you see Beijing holding the upper hand in these negotiations?
I think all of these things are very deliberate, especially the rare earths measures. You know, once you start digging into the details of that new regulation, it is extremely detailed. It had to take months to prepare. It was issued the day after a national holiday, so you know it was approved well before the national holiday. I think not only are these the same tactics, but as I said, these are just extensions of what we have seen before. And China is trying to tell President Trump that if Trump wants a trade war, it's really going to get a trade war. And I think both sides have very strong weapons that they can use against each other. I think this is a race to the bottom, and they need to stop it.
Well, we can head over to CNA.Asia for more coverage on trade tensions and the consequent market jitters, including this commentary on the timing of President Trump's tariff threats. Now, China and Malaysia begin their military drills in and around Malaysian waters today, with an Air Force exchange included in the exercise for the first time. 3 Chinese vessels, including a destroyer, arrived in Port Klang 2 days ago. And more than 1,000 personnel will take part in the 9-day exercise, featuring a range of equipment from helicopters to unmanned systems. The exercise will include simulations of search and rescue missions and maritime operations. Now, this is the 6th such exercise, and the Chinese Defense Ministry says it will focus on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and maritime security. Now, for more insights on the drills, we are joined by Dr. Ooi Sun, Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and he's speaking to us from Kuala Lumpur. Thanks, Dr. Oh, for joining us today. So, China framing the drills on humanitarian assistance grounds, given the timing of this, right after the Japan-Philippines drill, what message exactly do you think China is trying to send to the U.S. and its allies?
Well, of course, the obvious message would be that China does have its, shall we call them, partners in Southeast Asia, whereby China could also perform this sort of joint drills with its military partners within the Southeast Asia region. Also, of course, previously, not so long ago in September, you also saw China conducting similar drills, for example, with Thailand. So this is also an ongoing pattern of what we call the military diplomacy in order to make sure that the Chinese military and its counterparts in Southeast Asia are, shall we say, quote unquote, familiar with one another.
This year's exercise, the fact that it's scaled down kind of tells its own story. It's smaller than 2023 edition, which featured more troops and also multiple ASEAN states. So, Dr. Oh, what do you think? What's driving this smaller size, and what does it signal about Beijing's priorities with Kuala Lumpur right now?
Well, number one, of course, I think from at least the Beijing perspective, this sort of military joint drills would have to go on. But of course, now we have more heightened confrontations between China and the United States. It is perhaps not, shall we say, as easy as before to sort of rally or to round up as many Southeast Asian countries to conduct this sort of multilateral joint drills together. But on the other hand, of course, it also signals China's intention to deepen this sort of bilateral military ties and targeting country by country in order to conduct all these drills, as I said previously, in Thailand and also in Singapore and in Cambodia, for example, just this year alone.
So, like Southeast Asian countries, they've been invited to observe the exercise near Malaysian waters. So, curious to know, what about small states like Singapore, though, a key trading and maritime hub? How do you think they are viewing these maneuvers or processing the information?
Well, Singapore also conducted similar drills with China in the past, including, as I said, this year. So this is not something, well, at least from the Chinese and Malaysian perspective, especially targeting the small states such as Singapore as they suggest, of course, it's targeting a humanitarian rescue and disaster relief and so on. But I think the more important thing is, of course, for the Chinese military in a sense to, again, as I said, to familiarize itself with the Southeast Asian counterparts, and also for the Southeast Asian counterparts to sort of, shall we say, feel normalize the Chinese military presence in the area. Yeah.
So all of this kind of ties back to, I guess, ASEAN's ability to respond collectively. We've got Malaysia and Vietnam. They're both trying to stay on China's good side. Philippines taking on a harder line. So, Dr. Oh, where does this leave the whole ASEAN cohesion in practice? You know, I mean, what sort of a realistic, enforceable code of conduct actually need to contain?
Well, of course, the actual code of conduct, it's under negotiation. If you're talking about the South China Sea Code of Conduct, or COC, but of course, different ASEAN countries, they would have their different strategic and military calculations. Most countries, I think Malaysia included, would try to so-called strike a balance or so-called hedge between the United States and China, not only economically, but also strategically or militarily. And it is no secret, for example, that between the United States and Malaysia, between the United States and Thailand, for example, they are very intimate military collaborations, both in terms of personnel, in terms of equipments and so on. But of course, China, it's the, shall we call them, the elephant in the region, namely the huge presence in the region that none of us could ignore, including, for example, Malaysia and China having a bit of territorial disputes in South China Sea. So I think countries such as Malaysia, number one, of course, in a larger picture, they will have to balance between the US and China militarily. But more specifically, even if we are talking about the bilateral relations between China and Malaysia, they would, well, at least from a Malaysian perspective, you would have to balance between, on the one hand, handling the South China Sea disputes carefully, and on the other hand, still carry out some form of military collaborations, and in this case, joint drills with China.
A real balancing act there. Thank you so very much for your time. Thanks for speaking with us, Dr. Ooi Sun, Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Right, we're going to go for another short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Canadian Foreign Minister emphasizes she is going in eyes wide open ahead of a meeting with her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. More from a conversation with Anita Anand next. Canada is smoothing over relations with Asia's two largest economies. The Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, having just visited India and is due in China tomorrow. Well, she discussed Canada's sometimes sticky relationships in the region and the country's position on multilateralism with CNA's Lok Wei Su while visiting Singapore today.
There is no question that the relationship with China is complex and spans a number of sectors and different areas across the board. One of the reasons that I'm traveling to meet with my counterpart, Minister Wang Yi, is to ensure that we have a dialogue to be able to raise issues of concern for Canada and to be able to determine where is it that we can cooperate. There are indeed issues in every bilateral relationship. We are eyes wide open and indeed across the board seek to have that ability for a dialogue with a very important partner player in the Indo-Pacific.
Where dialogue grinds to a halt because neither side wants to cede any kind of ground, what can you do?
The relationship that we have with China is one where we have to address issues of concern for our country. I have previously served as the Minister of National Defense, and we have been able to have that dialogue. So I expect that to continue into the future, and I'm looking forward to my meeting with Minister Wang Yi tomorrow.
All right, let me bring you back to your speech at the UN General Assembly, which you delivered in September. And I mention this because you talk about dialogue. And your speech came a week after the delivery from the US president, in which he said, what is the purpose of the United Nations? He just writes a really strongly worded letter, but empty words don't solve wars or don't solve problems from his point of view. Dialogue, you could argue, is just words. What would your answer have been to
Well, as a sovereign country, Canada is fully committed to multilateralism. What is multilateralism? It is the rules-based international order that has kept us safe since the end of the Second World War. It is the United Nations process. It is the World Trade Organization. It is NATO. Those are all multilateral organizations, and Canada is committed to cooperating and collaborating within multilateral organizations. That's not just words. That is the foreign policy of our country, and it will continue to be the foreign policy of our country going forward.
So that's the values-based foreign policy that Canada
Actually, the three pillars of our foreign policy relate to defense and security at home and abroad of Canadian citizens. It involves the second pillar, which is economic resilience. In this time of economic stress, in this time where countries are retreating towards protectionism, Canada will remain committed to the multilateral order and the growth of our domestic economy. And then finally, core values, human rights, gender equality, making sure that we are showing up on the world stage where it matters most.
Your Prime Minister himself has conceded the erosion of the rules-based order and the subsequent lack of effectiveness for multilateral organizations such as the United Nations. You would agree with that?
I believe that countries can be most effective when they work together and they cooperate. Are there aspects of multilateral organizations that require an examination given current geopolitical conflict and given the retreat of some countries towards protectionism? Perhaps. But Canada will be there as a leader, promoting multilateralism, looking for a way to improve these organizations across the board. We will not retreat.
All right, the final question here, Minister Anand. That was interesting. Canada will be a leader. And we look about 9 years from your speech to the former Prime Minister's first speech at the United Nations. So Justin Trudeau, Canada is a modest country. We know we cannot solve these problems alone. That's in keeping with what you said. But we are Canadian. We are here to help. Not at that point to lead Canada. Is this a point of change for Canada? Final question.
We have a new Prime Minister, a new Foreign Minister, and a new foreign policy. And we are also confronting a geopolitical environment that was much different than 2015, and that includes intense economic stress where countries are retreating towards protectionism. So yes, we will be a leader in multilateral institutions to ensure that countries, including Canada, will be able to benefit from economic cooperation. And our foreign policy will be based on those three pillars: defense and security, economic resilience, so that we become the strongest economy in the G7, as well as a commitment to our core values. This is a clear and concise foreign policy, and it will drive our work going forward internationally.
We've got a full interview with Canadian Foreign Minister Anita Anand on Asia tonight. Digital innovation taking traditional stocks onto the blockchain, the same technology that powers cryptocurrencies. Now, tokenized securities are emerging as a new way for investors to view trading in company shares, even though a low rate of early adoption and regulatory uncertainty can make them a risky investment. Well, CNA's Roland Lim tells us more.
Tokenized stocks are securities represented as digital tokens on a blockchain. They're held in a digital wallet, much as crypto coins are. Each token mirrors the price of a real share. In principle, they can be digitally traded directly between investors without a traditional exchange. Imagine buying stocks, or at least some exposure to a stock, directly from your crypto wallet. Today, trades take about 2 days to settle, but with tokenization, settlement could happen in theory instantly, enabling 24/7 trading beyond stock market hours. Tokenization also enables fractional ownership, letting investors buy tokens that represent small portions of company shares for a fraction of the price of the real-world stock. It could lower barriers, boost diversification, and give emerging market investors easier access to global stocks without the need for foreign brokerage accounts. Platforms like Robinhood and Solana are already offering tokenized US stocks in Europe. Other crypto exchanges, Coinbase, Gemini, Kraken, are also exploring tokenization. Major banks are experimenting with tokenizing bonds and funds. For them, faster settlement means less capital locked up in processing, freeing up funds for other business users. But as the crypto industry hypes this as a leap forward, traditional financial firms and regulatory experts are raising alarm bells, saying it poses risks to investors and market stability.
You do not have voting rights as a holder of the tokenized asset, and the underlying security is simply mirrored. So you have price exposure without actual ownership and redemption rights.
Regulators in Singapore, Hong Kong and Europe are already working to clarify rules around this. Still, it's early days. But as frameworks mature, tokenized assets could help bridge traditional finance and the blockchain economy. For everyday investors, it could mean lower costs of trading and convenience, but also new risks to navigate. For CNA Explains, I'm Roland Lim.
Migrants to the UK may need to live in the country for 10 years before they can apply for permanent residency under proposed changes to the law. The Labour government is debating whether to double the period from the current 5 years, and that has sparked alarm among Hong Kong migrants under the British National Overseas Visa Scheme. Laura Westbrook files this report for CNA from London.
In the South London suburb, Hong Kongers gather to celebrate the Mid-Autumn Festival. But amid the festivities, a sense of apprehension. As they find themselves in the UK at a time of tightening immigration laws. Currently, migrants can apply for permanent resident status, known as indefinite leave to remain, after 5 years. The Labour government plans to double the qualifying period to 10 years as part of a package of plans to cut immigration. Whether this growing community, most of whom arrived under the British National Overseas Visa Scheme, are likely to be affected remains unclear. For now, the government says current rules to settlement continue to apply.
Many of you are seeing discussions in the government about changes.
Member of Parliament Luke Taylor sought to reassure his constituents that he would continue to put pressure on the government to deliver on promises made.
What the biggest problem is, it's moving the goalposts for those who are already on the scheme, who've made plans with their children. They know currently when they're going to get access to home fees for university, for example. They know when they're going to be able to settle down longer term. This risks unsettling them.
For Simon Ho, the delay would mean added financial costs and waiting longer to access his pension in Hong Kong. He arrived with his wife and 2 sons in 2021 and would be eligible for permanent residency next year if the UK keeps its promise.
I had to leave Hong Kong. I have to find some place to live. We don't intentionally want to do this. Yeah, it is forced.
In 2020, Beijing imposed a national security law on Hong Kong following months of anti-government protests. Chinese authorities say the law has restored stability to the city, but critics argue it's been used to silence dissent. The Conservative government of Boris Johnson responded by offering Hong Kongers with BNO status and their families a visa in 2021, with a route to permanent residency and eventual citizenship within 6 years. More than 160,000 Hong Kongers have arrived in the United Kingdom under the British National Overseas Visa Scheme. The government says it is consulting on whether BNO holders will be included in changes to residency rules. But it's that lack of certainty that has many Hong Kongers concerned. Sutton councillor Richard Choi is among those campaigning for Hong Kongers to be exempt.
It is a moral lifeline for the Hong Konger to move to the UK. And so we shouldn't see that as a regular immigration route. As it's a moral promise from the UK government.
The continuing immigration shake-up is affecting more than just Hong Kongers. The Labour government has ended overseas recruitment of social care workers, and migrants on skilled worker visas also face a potential 10-year wait to apply to settle in the country. A charity that helps Filipinos in the UK warns that the proposal could push foreign health workers away.
Filipino nurses differentiate the life of nurses in the US or nurses in the UK, which is a better place to go through. With these restrictive measures, we would see more Filipino workers think about where they would reside and where they would work.
Simon says he is committed to staying in the UK with his family long term, but hopes the government honours its initial promise so they can settle into their new home. For CNA, I'm Laura Westbrook in London.
And that wraps up Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.